Johnny Carson was laughing with his guest when the Vietnam veteran suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence and started sobbing uncontrollably on live television. What Johnny did next, captured by cameras that kept rolling, broke every rule of The Tonight Show and changed late-night television forever. It was March 7th, 1972, and America was still deeply divided over the Vietnam War. Protests filled the streets, families were torn apart by politics, and returning veterans were caught in the middle of a cultural war they never asked to fight. The Tonight Show was supposed to be an escape from all that, a safe, controlled space where America could laugh and forget about the chaos outside. But tonight, the chaos was about to walk onto Johnny Carson's stage and shatter that illusion completely. James Mitchell was 26 years old, though he looked closer to 40. 2 tours in Vietnam as an Army infantry sergeant had aged him in ways that went far beyond physical appearance. He'd been home for 8 months, living with his parents in Pasadena, California, trying and failing to adjust to civilian life. He couldn't hold a job. He couldn't sleep through the night. He couldn't walk through a grocery store without his hands shaking. James had started speaking at local high schools and community centers about his experience in Vietnam, not to protest the war or support it, but simply to help people understand what soldiers were going through. His talks were raw, honest, and increasingly well-attended. Someone from The Tonight Show's booking department had heard him speak at a veterans event and thought he'd make an interesting guest for a segment about the real cost of war. It seemed like a reasonable idea on paper. James was articulate, sympathetic, and had a compelling story. The producers planned to give him 8 to 10 minutes, enough time to share his perspective without getting too heavy for late-night television. They'd done segments on serious topics before. This would be handled with care, kept at a safe emotional distance, and wrapped up neatly before moving on to the next guest. What nobody knew, including James himself, was that he was about to have a complete psychological breakdown on live television in front of 20 million Americans. Johnny Carson started the interview exactly as he started every interview, with charm, humor, and careful control. He thanked James for his service, asked him some basic questions about where he was stationed, and gently guided the conversation toward what civilians might not understand about the war. James was doing well at first. He talked about the heat, the jungle, the constant fear. He described what it was like to be 19 years old and responsible for keeping other 19-year-olds alive. He was composed, measured, articulate. The audience was engaged but comfortable. This was manageable. This was fine. "So when you came home," Johnny asked, following the pre-planned questions, "what was the hardest part about adjusting back to normal life?" James paused. In that pause, something shifted in his expression. His jaw tightened. His eyes, which had been making steady contact with Johnny, suddenly fixed on something in the distance that no one else could see. "The hardest part," James began, his voice becoming quieter, "was realizing that nothing would ever be normal again." Johnny nodded sympathetically, preparing to ask his follow-up question. But James wasn't finished. "The hardest part was knowing that I did things over there." James's voice cracked. "I did things that I can never undo, things that haunt me every single night." The studio audience, which had been gently attentive, went completely silent. This wasn't the carefully managed conversation they'd been promised. This was something else entirely. "We were in a village," James continued, his words coming faster now, almost frantically. "We got bad intelligence. We thought it was a Viet Cong stronghold. We thought we were under attack. We thought—" His voice broke completely. His hands began shaking. And then, without warning, James Mitchell started crying. Not quiet, dignified tears, but deep, body-shaking sobs that made him double over in his seat. In the control booth, the director's voice crackled through the headsets. "Stay on him. Don't cut away. This is real." Johnny Carson sat in his chair, and for maybe the first time in his career, his famous composure completely deserted him. His face showed pure shock, then confusion, then something that looked like panic. This wasn't supposed to happen. Guests didn't break down on The Tonight Show. The show had rules, boundaries, carefully maintained emotional distance. This was violating all of it. "We killed children," James said through his sobs, and the words hit the studio like a physical blow. "There were children in that village, and we killed them. We didn't mean to. We didn't know. But they're dead, and He couldn't continue. He was crying so hard he couldn't breathe. His whole body was shaking. 20 million Americans were watching a man fall apart on live television, and nobody knew what to do. Ed McMahon, standing to the side of the stage, looked stricken. Doc Severinsen and his band sat, frozen. The studio audience was in shock. Some people were crying. Others looked away, unable to watch. This wasn't entertainment. This was trauma, raw and unfiltered, playing out in real time. And Johnny Carson, America's coolest host, the man who never showed real emotion, who kept everything light and managed and safe, made a decision that would define his career more than any joke he'd ever told. Johnny reached over and did something that violated every protocol of professional television hosting. He turned off his microphone. The audio cut out on his end, though James's microphone was still live, still broadcasting his sobs to millions of viewers. Then Johnny Carson stood up, walked around his desk, and sat down on the couch next to James Mitchell. He put his arm around the veteran's shoulders and pulled him close. Not a professional gesture of sympathy, a real embrace, the kind you give to a brother who's breaking. The cameras kept rolling. Nobody cut away. America watched as Johnny Carson, who never touched his guests, who maintained perfect emotional distance, who built his entire career on never letting anyone see him be truly vulnerable, held a sobbing veteran and let him cry. For 2 full minutes, that's all that happened. James cried into Johnny's shoulder while Johnny held him, occasionally whispering things that the microphones couldn't pick up. The audience sat in complete silence. Some were crying. Many looked away. This was too real, too raw, too uncomfortable for late-night television. Finally, James's sobs began to subside. He pulled back, wiping his face with his hands, looking mortified. "I'm sorry," he managed to say. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." Johnny turned his microphone back on. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion that he wasn't trying to hide. "Don't apologize," Johnny said. "Don't you dare apologize." He looked directly at the camera, speaking past James to the audience at home. This man served his country. He did what his government asked him to do. And now he's living with things that no 26-year-old should have to live with. Johnny turned back to James. "You need help. Do you have help?" James shook his head. "The VA, they try, but there's not enough. There's not enough resources, not enough doctors who understand. Most of us we're just trying to get through each day." What Johnny Carson did next was unprecedented in television history. He looked at the camera again and said, "If you're watching this and you're a mental health professional, if you work with veterans, if you have resources, we need you. This man needs you. All the men and women coming home from Vietnam need you." He gave out a phone number, the Veterans Crisis Line, and urged anyone struggling to call. Then he did something even more remarkable. He told James on live television, "You're going to come back here. Next week we're going to do this right. We're going to have experts here. We're going to talk about what veterans need, and you're going to start getting the help you deserve." The show went to commercial. In those few minutes while America saw advertisements for cars and soap, something extraordinary happened backstage. Johnny kept his arm around James, talking to him quietly, refusing to let go, even as makeup artists tried to touch up his face and producers tried to brief him on what came next. "Just breathe," Johnny kept saying. "Just breathe. You're okay. You're safe here." James was apologizing profusely, mortified that he'd lost control on national television. "I ruined your show," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry. I ruined everything." "You didn't ruin anything," Johnny said firmly. "You did the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do on this stage. You told the truth." Meanwhile, the production staff was in chaos. The phones were ringing off the hook, hundreds of calls flooding the switchboard. Some were complaints about the breakdown being inappropriate for late-night television, angry viewers demanding that the show return to its usual lighthearted format. But most were from veterans, from families of veterans, from people saying, "Thank you for showing this. Thank you for making people see." One call came from a veteran in Chicago who said he'd been holding a gun when the segment started, planning to end his life, and watching James break down had made him put the gun down and call for help instead. When the show came back from commercial, Johnny didn't try to lighten the mood or pivot to comedy. He addressed what had just happened head on. "What you just witnessed," he said, "was real. It was uncomfortable and it was painful, and it was exactly what we need to see. Because thousands of young men and women are coming home from Vietnam carrying trauma that we're not helping them with. And if we can't even watch a man cry about it for 2 minutes, how can we possibly help him heal from it?" The studio audience gave a standing ovation. Not the excited, energetic applause of a typical Tonight Show audience, but the serious, emotional applause of people who recognized they'd witnessed something important. Johnny kept his promise. James Mitchell came back the following week, and Johnny dedicated an entire episode to veterans' mental health. He brought in psychiatrists who specialized in what would later be called PTSD. He brought in other veterans who shared their stories. He used his platform, the most watched late-night show in America, to shine a light on an issue that the country was largely ignoring. The response was overwhelming. The Veterans Crisis Line received over 5,000 calls in the week following that first episode. Dozens of mental health professionals volunteered their services to work with veterans. Community support groups started forming across the country. Johnny's network, initially nervous about the controversial content, was flooded with letters from grateful viewers who said the show had changed their understanding of what veterans were going through. For James Mitchell, that night marked a turning point. The breakdown was terrifying, but Johnny's response, the complete absence of judgment, the immediate pivot to getting help, gave James permission to stop hiding his pain. He started intensive therapy, joined a veteran support group, and slowly began to rebuild his life. 3 years later, in 1975, James Mitchell graduated with a degree in social work. He dedicated his career to helping other veterans navigate their trauma. He eventually became the director of a veterans' mental health center in Los Angeles, directly helping thousands of men and women who returned from Vietnam and later from other wars carrying invisible wounds. Johnny Carson and James Mitchell stayed in touch for years. Johnny would occasionally call to check in, to ask how James was doing. Johnny never publicized this relationship. It was simply one human being caring about another. The March 7, 1972 episode became one of the most requested clips in Tonight Show history. It's been credited with helping change public perception of PTSD, encouraging more research into combat trauma, and giving thousands of suffering veterans permission to ask for help. But perhaps more significantly, that night changed Johnny Carson himself. People who worked with him said after James Mitchell, Johnny was different. He was more willing to let real emotion into his show. He was less interested in keeping everything safe and controlled. After that night with James, one producer recalled years later, Johnny understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do on television is just be present with someone who's suffering. Not fix it, not joke about it, not wrap it up neatly, just be there. The moment when Johnny turned off his microphone and held a crying veteran has been called the most human moment in late-night television history. It violated every rule of television hosting. It was uncomfortable, unscripted, and completely real. And it reminded millions of Americans that behind the jokes and the charm and the carefully constructed entertainment, there are real people dealing with real pain. James Mitchell lived a full life. He married, had children, and spent over 3 decades helping veterans heal. When he died in 2008 at age 62, his obituary mentioned his service in Vietnam, his work with veterans, and the night he broke down crying on Johnny Carson's couch. At his funeral, there was a letter from Johnny Carson, written years earlier, kept by James's wife for exactly this moment. It said simply, "Thank you for trusting me with your pain. Thank you for showing America that asking for help is not weakness. Thank you for your service, your courage, and your friendship. You changed my life that night as much as I might have changed yours." The story of Johnny Carson and James Mitchell reminds us that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stop pretending everything is fine. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer is not solutions or advice, but simply our presence. And sometimes breaking down on national television can break open the conversation that a whole country needs to have. If this story of unexpected vulnerability and the courage to show real emotion moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who might be struggling and needs to know it's okay to ask for help. Have you ever witnessed a moment of raw honesty that changed how you see the world? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video for more untold stories about the real moments behind television's greatest legends.